I want to talk about EN. Previously, I've indicated standard result not that long ago the tensor products of the octonions and split octonions form a basis of a Cat-Movie algebra E8, and that has been forming the way in which um, the way in which well the weak force and the strong force and the electromagnetism are united with gravitation. Like in twistor theory, you need to be able to assume that you can have a compactified bin cosmic space over complex numbers. And it readily becomes clear that at that level, those levels, up to E8, one needs simply to redo core model theory with its ultimate L and omega logic. It needs to be done not over L round brackets reals, but L round brackets octonions. That is the big difference. And that will make sure everything compares, hopefully. And for that comparison, everything is done the same except you use these octonions for the universally bare sets, which are only relevant for commutative sets. That's why the whole theory that's been put forward for so long fails. You need these octonions which are guaranteed to have certain number systems with them quite nicely, and that means that they have modular arithmetic and also arithmetic geometry. That means that their solutions and geometry is based on arithmetic or other discrete sets with an induction axiom, which is precisely what a fine structure is. That falls out of known substructures that there are these numbers in the octonions, and in the E8 they can find them quite well, and they enable you to define fine structure. So E8 is that limit set, and that defines by the Cartan subalgebras basically ways from the empty set developing into the smallest inner model, and maps that are elementary between them connected by truth predicates, which are passages through the Cartan subalgebras, the Cat-Movie algebras. They will form topologies not commutatively because it's a Lie algebra, and that is how the derived geometry is formed. The differential graded operators are formed, which, because basically the whole thing is proven inductively from a bare empty set. One can doubt as bare empty set, but one is doubting nothing because it doesn't exist, so one can't doubt it. That is actually the inverse of Anselm's argument of God, that the empty set must exist because it doesn't. I don't know. So there's a unique empty set. Now, it is quite interesting when you look at E9, E10, 11, which are such groups with those 11 elements, 9, 10 elements, symmetry groups. The 9 would be the affine solutions of all of those E8 solutions. Now, the E8 solutions are or can be represented by subrecursive functions on a base set of girls miniature L over and over again, and those will form either maps or elementary maps, depending on whether we push through that particular black hole or you don't, or you go to higher symmetrical monoidal product and get higher masses. So that's quite clear. So what you need to do is look at the topology on the E8 groups which form the monster group or monster groups, and their topology between them. That is merely the representation into the string through 32 elements, so 32 spinners, and that forms M11, or a kind of M11. M11 with no information, it's affine. It's an affine solution. No greater information is got by putting more and more stuff in there. It's the same information. Now it's been conjectured that actually E10 with hyperbolic information, as expressed in the sort of squares, minus another one, is actually a constant one. Now that is hyperbolic. It means basically the more motifs you've got, then the more motifs are available. The more motifs you've got, it is resplendency, it is hyperbolic, and it means the determinant of the Cartan matrix is actually -1, which means it has a Nagiburi's surface which you may well want to have an idea that on its boundary there is this hologram formation on those motifs. It's obeying 6 yoga logic, and they will put there's counting boundaries on a Dinking diagram, and counting boundaries on a Dinking diagram with 3 relations, x, y, z, all not just being non-associative but actually different than themselves, and those are conditions on the boundary. If it is 0, and that's fine. You don't have to go any further, but it may not be. You'll have a probability space on all those represented on the Newtonian non-commutative spaces, which reflect, because you build it up from the ground up, and you're doing it on a non-Archimedean real numbers with ultrafilters. That would basically mean you have a norm automatically, a norm on the Newtonians which spreads to the E8 field, and that relates to the differential operator, which is a topological one that goes up to the next level through the derived exterior algebras. My point is that actually the differential algebra, Dirac operator, is a linear partial order differential equation operator. Now, it doesn't have to be linear, and it isn't actually linear if you have 2 symbol systems, and in the case that everything lines up at the boundary, that basically means that it is linear, and the linearity means games on the axonal vector bundles, and that's quite nice. It basically means that when everything flashes up between the boundary and the bulk, it basically means you have a linear transmission over the axons, which is the gravitational pulse when it refers to elementary particle physics, rather than a higher scale of what we see as brains, although particles are just brains themselves, but they are actually finitely bounded because of the univocity not holding in the real world, and actually chaos being the actual limit of the world, the boundary conditions of the world, which formed naturally into these spinor pairs with the undefinable element, which is the Everett tilings. So that it all goes off quite automatically like that, which is numbers floating in chaos and forms structures. Now, these structures actually go a long way without obstruction until you find that the simple system of the differential equation operator for the Lie algebra actually becomes over the octonians. It becomes there's a disparity in it, and that follows basically by Gödel numbers in the same way. It's noted that there are many different systems of Gödel numbers. Always you can do it in base 1000, you get a different numbers, but they would be a translation between them. But these 2 types of disagreement of Gödel numbers are fundamental and they can't be removed, and they're there always. It's just with numbers pumping along. It's just how numbers work. They work like that, and so you will get 2 differential linear operators, 2 Dirac measures, and that non-equivalence means there's Fredholm operators which can't be put together into uniform one. This is basically what subcompact card was. However, you would hope they are resolved in E9, which is just a affine combination of these things. So, but it's thought really that M10 or M11 is unified by the next one, which is E10 and E11. E11 would be a Lorentzian metric. There is information actually passed in space-time with a constant. It's passed by a constant, and that information basically forms black holes. So when the whole system of God in his absolute nothingness of the Kyoto school actually forms from the hyperbolic system into E11, that means again, I imagine, really, that the hyperbolicity of absolute nothingness creates rapid black holes in the system of God himself, and it doesn't look very good. God himself feels a little bit trapped by this. So that is the perfect union between the Aufhebung of Hegel and the adjoint functors and the adjunct principles of adjunctions in normal category theory and the Kyoto school. They're related like that. So so it's interesting that E11 is thought to be controlled by compactification on a torus of E10, the maximum compact support, and that would suggest a torus structure, and you would imagine it's a quantum structure on that, which basically means the generators are infinite and they are non-commutative. They become non-commutative. So after that stage, you get a non-commutative system of generators, all of which are infinite. Those numbers are numbers, and they go in a way of progression along that axonal system with its lack of agreement on what is now the big L of light, of Fichte, and the only way to get around those is by these squared numbers, which are ultrafilters in the commutative sense or the non-commutative sense, and those things are measuring how much the E10 system fits together on a compact support, perhaps, and that is the M11. M11 was supposed to be the end of it all, but one has E12, of course, which would be a union of all those three things into one. That would be the torus. E12 would be a torus, and that would be a non-commutative torus. It would be a quantum effect in God himself on the motif theory, which has never been satisfactorily finished. One can only assume one gets to a point right at the top, and that could only be E12, E13, E14, E15, and that would be an axonal push away, with God feeling perhaps less and less things, and thinking his thought at the top. It must be an omega groupoid himself, or rather a big one, and no one understands even E12 in any way, except if you choose the most irrational function possibly. Then you're getting, indeed, within God, within the motifs of six functor yogas, you would actually get these doubles with undefinable, which would only mean that you get tilings within God rather than plane, and that because the numbers are still defined, the fine structure has to continue with this monotony of two ones next to each other, or 1 and 0 and 1, which is still definable with no gaps really. Then the same Hydra Hercules would function on these infinity motifs, but because you are in fact taking the subrecursive functions or sub-subrecursive functions, if you want to start with the E7 group, then it would basically mean that you have these doubles and ones all the way up. Now, no one knows anything about E12 apart from a few facts that if you start with these structures of two ones and ones, you again get a tiling. So yeah, that's what, and the important thing is the position of E12, where God is to some extent unified to the first extent, then you can actually derive the fine structure constant, which is a constant of physics, which seems random in the physical world. You can measure it, but it always comes out the same value. Now, the E12 actually predicts what that fine structure is precisely, and it's derivable from the golden mean when expressed over the light of the light, not the light of physics, but the light of spirituality and motifs, and that fine structure constant just comes out as the right number if you at least assume that you're getting these two ones which seem to be derived from induction upwards from the empty set with the smallest inner model of the immaculate conception of the physicality into the immaculate conception of spirituality, and that would simply follow. Whether it follows for E13, I don't know. I don't seem to be anything about E13, but in the E12 papers there's a couple in 2008, and that's what all they kind of said. All it tells you, the initial singularity of the initial empty set, which seems to be unique without quite new foundation. It seems to be the case that the actual initial singularity of the universe, which is emptiness or nothing or no concepts whatsoever, that becomes surrounded by complete chaos, space-time chaos, so it can never actually be approached again. It's still there, but it cannot actually be approached. It's not actually covered by an ultrafilter at all, but it is covered by chaos, and that chaos is the thing that generates a small L with a small L. And the chaos Moses of God, which creates all possibility of spirituality as he becomes dissociated and gets back into his previous levels of godhood into the world. So the question is whether these inductively defined motif theories of God, whether they actually produce a quantum theory over spirituality. It's spirituality of the tame maps from the monster groups into the class of ordinals at that level, whatever they are. The ordinals may change from level to level. So yeah, of course they can. So so it depends how those spirituality functions are like Tesla's electricity, how they map into the final E infinity. You know, that should be God, and it should all be. There should be no possibility of progression from E infinity. E infinity is the class of class which is resulting from an infinite, as a natural numbers, progression of axonal firings of God Himself into the next vertex operator algebras, which involve only pretain forcing the level of monster groups, and that basically one would hope that there is a finality in that. There is a finality in that, and but nothing is known about E12, really anything, at least not that I found. There doesn't seem to be anything found at E30 with how they form. That surely there would be a Dirac operator again, or something. A jump from E is only a it is only a combination of what comes before. In threes, I imagine, the Octonian system, wherever it is, in threes, or over the motifs, and they should go up forward as before in the prime numbers again. The prime numbers just asserting the reality of commutativity at each level, and they should in fact provide new solutions until the final moment, which is God and the alpha point. Before I was looking for omega points past the class of orders, but because it's formed in the monster group, it is actually only on itself. It is that is the point at which one cannot conceivably rationally go any further, because it's all there. So that is surely the omega point of Taylor Chardon. It is a very it is a definite point. There's no ambiguity about it. It must exist, and it must be reached by the empty set. And as it's an omega groupoid, it will form an omega groupoid of topologies, and it will promulgate downwards as an omega groupoid does, filtering basically the non-commutativity of the motifs of motifs, as Emily Real has investigated, but as she investigated in this way using the Dirac operator, which is only a reshuffling of all possible generators. In E12 there will be infinite number of generators. These will be shuffled around just as much. The problem getting over Wooding cardinals is in fact the problem of moving generators. You apply something and then the whole thing moves, and you have to move something before you move something. It is in fact the Whiteheadian thing that the line extenders are members of themselves. What does it mean by line extend on a motif of motifs? It is a member of itself. I don't know. No one's ever gone as far as I know past E12, E13, E14, E15, then an undefinable one, and you would have to come back down in yourself to join in a basically a three group on that to form a torus. That torus would be quantum torus of quantum gravity. And now the interesting thing is if you relate all this to two things. First of all, the conspectral triple, which let me see. Well, yeah, I suppose if you're building up from the ground below on topological fields with evaluation, which should be derivable from the Dirac operator, even if it's over motifs, then you should just be able to get these conspectral triples. They will be quantum mechanics inside God's mind, his dynamics rather than his feeling. And again, all the duality between ZFC models, whatever they are, with class field theory, and Hamilton models over class forcing, which should always be pre-tame still, or at least tame. And they should all sort of mean that God has his dynamics as well as his feelings, and he himself cannot always, I think, understand where his pretensions are actually headed to. And this would in fact be the most exact mathematical understanding of God ever envisaged, and it would be a mathematically unknown one, because these Dirac operators going from E12 to E13 are completely unknown, and whether they actually form consubject algebras over Cyril bases on Cyril bases, in much the same way that tilings have tilings within them in the DNA strand. So does God, but they are different. It is univalent. It won't be univalent, hopefully, and that univalence means it basically stops at that omega point, which cannot be got any further. It is a definite application of uncountable numbers of Octonian systems, all developed differently initially, and the movement from one godhead to another should still be borrow over the initial thing. It should still satisfy a certain class type theory of Hellman, essentially, which he doesn't really specify anyway. But so all these things like that. So yeah, you should still get the topologies on the motifs should follow in the same way. So what is that? So the thing I would say is that the forcing through is a game theory, basically. Now, game theory has become compositional. It was originally not done very well, but it was the first go, but the idea was that it wasn't really good enough. But this seems to be just merely an application of the quantum geometric Landlands transform repeated over and over, and you have this point at the top, which makes the whole category of categories into a loop space. Now, this will be guaranteed, I am sure, by a recursive feedback or backtracking onto the turbulence of Greg Horth, which I've never really looked at, but that should be the way that things compare into an infinity, which is a point. That should be the way that God's existence is proven absolutely. But God God himself will have many, many facets to him, an infinite number of facets. It's a question to have how those facets of the essential quantum realm of dynamics of God actually influences both the feeling of mankind and his thoughts and his aesthetics and his love, and those would be very much fractalized within him. I imagine whatever fractal means. So yeah, the extension from E12 to E13 to E infinity is the way to solve, essentially, by doing it over vertex operator algebras of motifs in real sense, but on what they call, I forget what they call them, the different ideas of these things, how big they get. But that would, now the question is, how do they affect things? I always pointed out that the fine structure constant seems to be determined by E12 with a small assumption which I can't think can be derived actually. So it does have definite effects. So that would be the way to understand how God, in all his pigness, actually affects the finite world that we're in. What extent are we mirrored in God ourselves? And what extent are we in God, in fact? To what extent does our mentality inhere in a particular E27? How are those levels related? Are there any surprises? Is it actually fully commutative, or at each stage does it have a non-commutative octane structure itself, with different fragments of the previous levels of E16 in them, which are in fact determined by Fichte's light and non-elementary maps between them. So how is this affecting things very, very low down? In E8 systems, E8 will be refracted in each of those E27s or E millions and 27s, and they may be very significant structures because E8 would still retain its principal structure of the only non-associative normed division algebra, and which is non-commutative. However, yeah. So as E12 is formed, the boundary conditions would hopefully become closer, and those boundary conditions are basically edges of the thinking diagram from one to the other. So more and more conditions are there, and the octonions feed upon octonions, I suppose, in the thinking diagrams, which will have to be the way to construct these extra Lie algebras, I suppose. So that's that, and that is that. But it is a way to understand Fichte's aspect of light, and the fact that you're looking at these Lorentz or affine or hyperbolic combinations of squared. That is basically, you've got to measure over these. You've got to measure an ultra filter over these things, over these 9 tuples to 10 tuples to 11 tuples, or 1,027 tuples, and yeah. So if it all ends in a point, which it should, it would mean in God's fullness he does not actually experience turbulence, although in his quantum dynamics he may temporarily, in his understanding, experience these things. However, in his fullness he doesn't. It will be contradictory, not because we don't like that to happen. It's because the E infinity Kac-Moody algebra of infinite dimensions with Cartan subalgebra should actually only allow these linear differential operators on the omega group point. Now this kind of suggests all the mathematics very sloppy, and I believe that in fact I believe that it's not great, but yeah. So I know that I remember once being at Jen's house when I was a young PhD student, and he made mockery of Cantor's theological idea of getting more and more higher levels until you reach God. Well, Jensen stopped at on. He did a bit about class forcing Jensen coding. He also speculated there wasn't actually an ultrafilter over the numbers, which means basically an omega ultrafilter, which is what one's looking for, by a recursive procedure which goes into consistency of all arithmetic, starting from the empty set and feeding back. That infinity would in fact be produced by these E0 Gensen predicates on the final Lie algebra infinity, with no symmetry breaking apart from at lower level. So that was how God can be perfect yet still be dynamic. So he, at the omega group point, he really pushes down his understanding. At that point, he doesn't seem to actually have any feeling for anything at all. He seems to have no feeling. He is complete. Yet, just like string theory has its symmetry breaking, and spin glass theory has its replica symmetry breaking, and the P equals MP problem, although it's trivial, though I have solved it quite easily. But the Riemann hypothesis has its breakages in the Weil subgroups over the exterior algebras. And these exterior algebras are just the Gödel numbering in a different format, and they are formed by the differential operators of Lie groups, which go from the Con group into the differential operators. So that is the only way to understand God. In this fullness, he seemed to be purely axonal. He seemed to be purely communicating with himself faster. As a one, he is a one, and he communicates. It seems that he communicates. It must be instantaneously with himself. He pushes down into these breakages of his own symmetry and his quantum dynamics. Why couldn't we just start with God at the beginning? It's because we couldn't form him, because the way to form him is through consecutive Dedekind finiteness, which is actually represented immediately by the surreal numbers with no gaps in them. So you need the perfectoids and the octonions on them for 3-player games, essentially. 2-player games is no good. It's boring. But however, in the formulation of compositional game theory, which I'm afraid they don't actually show their system in non-empty. They say what it is, but they don't actually say you can form these things at all. And they say what's required, but they don't actually give an example. And I'm not sure if their definition is completely correct for that to happen in any way whatsoever. You need the completeness at the end. So anyway, it does actually. I'm getting quite interested in the ideas of model theory actually. Because when you use the monster, where the idea of the monster model in model theory of Schiller and all these people, Roskovsky and Zilber, the monster model, it's got the same word as the monster group, and every group kind of seems to map into this monster group, and there's monster groups for different theories. In compositional gradient theory, one way to do it through arrows and bifunctors on bimodules is basically by having an equilibrium condition at the end of the process which you are conceiving. This equilibrium condition, I'm not sure how they define it, I've not really looked at it, but it seems to have a certain expression of ultimate homogeneity in the discernibles of that language, and those things are what is a model theory. Model theory has the idea that a shuffling around of the parameters and some small model will actually be replicated in the monster model, or the monster model for a particular theory, and that will go up through the topological advances from E11 to E12, although they don't discuss that in any way whatsoever. I don't know why it's all sloppy. I don't know why. So we have all these ideas of saturation and type theory, and how many different types are available at each level, producing some non-forking forking extensions in model theory, which becomes very interesting, particularly because representations on a simple quantum torus over the Gödel's L will actually have form into the maximum model. They call it the maximum models. That's a very interesting concept, that the dynamics is related to something very physical. Now, how is that related? In fact, it's completely unrelated. No one's ever thought about this stuff, and I'm not either. The thing is, how do you actually define the body in Badger? It's by some sort of binary process that reacts to some forcing condition. Forcing condition is both filling diamonds up and expanding diamonds into the topology, and it's a topological operator which is support, I think, is unites M10 to 11, and then it will go further into E infinity. However, so well, I don't know, that seems to be there. So the subcompacts are there. So how they all resolve because it's the final point. So it is. So people think God is perfect, and therefore there's no movement. That's nonsense, complete nonsense. He's a point that moves. He's an unmoved mover, and he does move himself eternally. But anyway, these monsters, these ideas of the maximum group are very, very interesting. In just a simple idea of the quantum torus, which is basically underlying all these Markovitch theories, and also, of course, the idea of the face in Levinas, and also, indeed, in the idea of cosmology itself in conformal cycling. They're all the same, represented over octonian systems of various levels, Bernoulli diagrams, basically. So one relates to the other, and so these if you do it quantumly, which you should do, then you get these maximal models. They are the dynamic. They represent the dynamics through as a single model. Now, in Badger's idea of the body, you get these kind of filter over what he says are normal sets, but they're not sets. They should be sets over octonions, because you should be able to replace the universally bare sets by universally octonian sets, and you should be able to do the game theory over base the axons, which I'm just suggesting should be by these arrows of formulation, perhaps, which they haven't actually fulfilled. But that is basic game theory, and when the game is working, you develop these measures, which basically means omega 1 and omega 2 are measurable in that model. That's all it is. And so so it all pushes through like that. So yes, you get these maximal models, the models of uniqueness, maximal uniqueness, the most beautiful things, and those should be the paths in all the world which are in fact followed, unless you have these contradictions in the symbol systems of the differential operators, which are there because octonions are there, and in fact, not the octonions, the split octonions are there. So the existence of split octonions is the reason for all these things. And octonions are the most arbitrary algebra possible, except the Dinking diagrams, which are formed through the Dirac. So in model theory, all these results are largely independent of all set theory, although they're all about ordinals and models. There's chunks of new model theory which isn't being used in set theory much. There's a bit of topology and a bit of that. And my thesis was about that Chang conjecture, which is model theoretic, Johnson structures, model theoretic. But there seems to be no deep relationship between large cardinal theory and core model theory, even perfectoid theory, and these model theories. It's very, very strange that should be the case. And there are certain things. I looked flicking through all this literature last night. It seemed to be that there are certain limit gaps where the structures at the end of some model theoretical construction are not actually unique, and that obviously the non-uniqueness suggests that you're working inductively in new foundations. There's no mention of this at all in the foundations of model theory. They just say assume a monster model, which when I read it 15 years ago, I had to put the book down because I didn't understand it, and I still don't. And because it's not a trivial thing that they were trying to explain, because they didn't understand it, so they fudged it. That's what mathematics is, I'm afraid. So anyway, I'll try and find the book again and have another go, because I know they're fudging it, because I've seen it all over mathematics. They're just fudges, I'm afraid.